Hi, and welcome back to Mr. Opera. And we're getting a little bit fancy today because I want to talk about a project that's really important to me that I've been doing on the side, you could say, when I'm not singing on the stage or preparing to sing on the stage. I remember as a student being really confused when I was told that the cricothyroid muscle and the thyroarytenoid muscle worked in opposition to each other, and that this was a lot like my biceps and my triceps, and the way that they work in opposition to move my arm. The biceps, when it gets short, and the triceps get long, it bends my arm, and then if I contract this one and lengthen this one, it extends my arm. That's really simple. Wouldn't it be great if your voice were that simple, and if, it was the equivalent of like this is head voice and this is chest voice. But it just doesn't work that way. And that's why I was never actually able to apply that knowledge. So I kind of lost interest in it. But lately I've been around YouTube and I see that people who sell their services as voice pedagogues and, also even some people who write books and stuff are really into this idea.
We produce head voice with muscles that are called the cricothyroid muscles.
I will often refer to the chest register as the thyroarytenoid muscle or TA dominant mechanism, and to the middle and head registers as the cricothyroid muscle or ET dominant mechanisms
or cricothyroid muscles.
Physically, the main difference between head and chest voice are which muscles are used in your larynx. In chest voice, the thyroarytenoid muscles are predominantly engaged.
And just like any muscle, just like any athletic endeavor, it just takes strength building and coordination, takes a little bit of time, but stick with it, especially the damp and release onsets and the attack and release onsets.
So let's try that. Hey, now that's definitely, hey, you can hear that's more chest.
These muscles shorten and thicken your vocal cords. In head voice, the
cricothyroid muscles
are predominantly engaged, and those muscles stretch and thin the vocal cords.
Now I have to let the cords thin. Hey, so I'm bringing in that head voice. Hey.
Here's the problem. If you want to correct this information, here's a correct version of just how the arytenoid cartilages move. If we're talking about the
cricothyroid muscles
and the thyroarytenoid, then we're talking about the arytenoid cartilages, right? Have I lost you yet? I hope so, but let's lose you even more. Located on the superolateral aspects of the wider posterior, on the this is fucking hard. Located on the superolateral aspects of the wider posterior cricoid cartilage lamina are the paired pyramidal-shaped arytenoid cartilages. Each cartilage has a superior apex, an anterior vocal process, and a large lateral muscular process. Attached to the apices of the arytenoid cartilages are the small, paired, and conical-shaped corniculate cartilages. Okay, what we've done so far is describe this, and there's the problem right there. A good description of things is going to take pages, and it's going to be really, really hard. It's hard to think. I can't. Okay, so I know what that means. What I was just reading to you, I know what it means. But I know what it means because I had to go and animate it. I had to go and fix the model so that it agrees with that. So I went word by word. But if you're just trying to learn how things go, wouldn't it be a whole lot better if we had a nice way to do that? If we had a way to do that makes sense to your brain, that's not going to require you to go and look up 30 words and not going to require you to build a whole 3D model by yourself. Maybe if I build one for you, which is what I've done. So here we go. Now we can see from here that the thyroarytenoid and the cricothyroid aren't really in a position to work in opposition. So if we look at this from the side, in 2 dimensions, maybe then, yeah, we would get the impression, hey, this thyroarytenoid muscle and then these cricothyroid muscles, they kind of run in the same direction. So it makes sense that they would be in opposition. You know, just like your biceps and your triceps are right there running alongside each other, kind of parallel. But that's only an impression we get if we're thinking in 2 dimensions. If we shift the view a little bit, well, now we get a whole different impression. Now they don't line up like your biceps and your triceps would line up. They're kind of at a 45-degree angle. They're not perpendicular, but they're not parallel either. So thinking of these as muscles that can work in opposition doesn't really make any sense. What we're actually dealing with is a whole bunch of muscles that have to work together to get anything done, because this whole contraption here is really complex. So we've got a lot of muscles here that need to be accounted for if we're going to be talking about some kind of gesture with the larynx. One day I was doing a search for 3D models of the vocal tract. So I acquired a bunch of these 3D parts, and they were just simple objects, and they didn't move or anything like that, but I was able to assemble them together and start to get a better idea of my own vocal anatomy. And it started to strike me as really odd that many things I found complicated when they were written down or when they were shown to me in 2 dimensions suddenly made perfect sense when I could imagine them in 3 dimensions. Although they didn't move, I was able to sort of fly around and look at how things are put together. And that gave me the idea, well, wouldn't it be great if it did move? Wouldn't it be great if this was animated? And wouldn't it be great if it moved in a way that shows me how my own body moves? Not just on the outside, but on the inside. And I got to thinking about that with the vocal tract itself. And then I got to thinking, well, why stop at the vocal tract? Couldn't we actually move the spine as well? And couldn't we, as time goes on, just start adding more and more parts? So I sort of casually tried to make it so that the parts could be animated and move. And I, of course, noticed, like everyone notices who tries to do something with no idea of how to do it, that it didn't work. The parts wouldn't bend and move correctly. I got all kinds of crazy results. Then I found out that, building models that can move is a whole thing. It's a whole discipline. It's not easy. So I went about teaching myself, as best as I could, how to animate this model, how to build this model in such a way that I could animate it. Now the job started to look really huge. But the lockdowns were looking really long, so I got to work. As I got deeper and deeper into the project, it started to seem kind of a waste of time to me if I stopped at what I could do by myself. Not only am I, at the moment, not sharing this model with you other than as these rendered animations that I can show you, I'm also only developing the model as far as one person can on their time off. That's where you come in. If you're a grad student, don't you think this would make a really great thesis for you? I'm looking for help. You're looking for a thesis. Let's go. If you're interested in being part of that, I've started a repository on SourceForge. It's very bare bones right now, just a name and, an example screenshot of what Larry does. But if you join up, I can share the Blender file with you and we can get to work making this into a broader project. The idea behind opening the repository is to start building a collection of people who contribute to the project. Because the project is going to be crowdsourced, it's going to be also open sourced and democratic. So if you're worried about disagreeing with others and having to work on a project that you disagree with, don't worry. If a group of people feel like an open source project is going in the wrong direction, they can split off and go in their own direction because it's open source. So as long as you respect the terms of the license, you can do whatever you want. The name of the project, Laryngocentric Anatomical Research and Reference Interface, talks about two functions, research and reference. Let's start with reference, because that's the simplest, and I think that's the first part of this project that can be developed in a really impactful way. At the moment, in order to interact with the project at all, you have to be able to run a program called Blender. Blender is free, but it's not easy for a computer to run it. It's a little bit more taxing than just running a video game. However, Blender also comes with a free game engine, which means that the 3D model right now that lives in Blender can be turned into a game, quote unquote, or a downloadable app that most people could run on a computer with average capabilities. The animations themselves aren't that complex. The only thing that's complex is how the model actually decides to move and how the parts relate to each other. But by the time you have a game that you can download, all those decisions have been sort of made really easy for the computer. So once Larry is turned into a downloadable app, it can be distributed to anyone who wants to use it for free, as long as they're just a private individual. When it comes to organizations and such, well, that's a different story. But when it comes to just someone who wants to understand how their voice works, or probably that private teacher in a studio, no one's going to care that they downloaded it and checked it out and showed their student how their voice works. In fact, that's really encouraged. And that's not something people would have to pay for. Of course, if a bunch of people want to contribute to the project and they get the idea that it's a good way to make money, no one's going to stop them. It's possible to turn something like this into a platform for offering services to people. The sky's the limit. It's open source, and as long as you follow the rules of the license, which are, pretty easy to follow, then nobody's going to have a problem. Something really cool about Blender is that any value, any variable can drive any other variable. So anything that you have going on that you feel is significant, that can be kind of linked to something else. And it's also possible to come up with new inputs, new data that you're picking up from somewhere and combining with Larry. So for instance, motion capture is still kind of young right now, but it's getting better and better, which is when someone wears a suit with little markers on it, just little white dots or something on a black suit, and they move around and the camera is tracking those points. And that can be translated into an animation. So it would be possible, for instance, to record yourself and do motion capture and translate that into Blender and into Larry. Which actually brings us to the research part of this, because that kind of thing is really sophisticated and maybe not what the average consumer would be into. But when it comes to research, Larry has the potential for correcting a lot of mistakes that are going to tend to come up just from the fact that people are doing research on one sort of isolated subsystem, and they're not directly plugging that into the results from some other researchers who are looking at maybe some other subsystem. When we take the results of different research and plug it into Larry, they should agree. It shouldn't be asking Larry to do one thing and then not do that same thing at the same time. And it shouldn't give us absurd results. Although I'm not a researcher myself, I do understand something about biases in research. Now, there's a really important research bias that's called the observer effect. The classic way people talk about the observer effect is the trouble that people had trying to look at electrons. So in nuclear physics, we have these protons and electrons and neutrons and different parts of the atom. And the way that we look at things in the first place started to affect the results that they were getting when they tried to look at electrons. So how do we look at things? Well, we use light, don't we? And if a place is really dark, we make light, we bounce the light off of something, and then we collect the light somehow. Maybe with our eyes, maybe with a camera, but in some way we collect that light and we can see what's going on. When we look at something, we don't knock it over. We don't, if you look at me and I look at you, no one feels any kind of push backwards. There are some rather goofy fake martial artists and stuff who try to convince people that they can like move them with their mind and beat people up, knock people out without touching them and stuff. But it's complete bullshit. So when we look at things, we don't move those things. But when we tried to look at electrons, we ran into a problem. Those bits of light that we use to look at things can be thought of as waves or as particles. And as particles, they're too massive to look at electrons because when they hit the electron, they alter the course of the electron. And that means you can't see what the electron was doing in secret. Every time you look, all you're seeing is you shoving stuff around. And that's called the observer effect. In voice research, I think we have this same effect in spades. Let's say that you come to my concert or something like that, and you hear me singing, and I'm up there vocalizing, and I'm like, right? And you're, oh, let me see how you do that. The fact that you're looking at me changes my behavior. The fact that you're using these instruments encourages me to change my behavior even more. Because if I behaved like I do on the stage.
The best posture for this exam is to sit forward with your shoulders relaxed and your chin up. This allows for the throat to open and allows for the best exam. The scope is passed through your nose and then to the back of your throat. In this case, we're connecting the scope to a screen so that you can see.
If I really behave like I do on the stage, well, you have that stuff in my throat. Either I'm going to get hurt or you're not going to get a good view. The two are not compatible. So what do? I modify the way that I sing. I try to get as close as possible while letting you see my vocal folds with this thing that you've got down my throat. That's the observer effect right there, because what you wind up seeing isn't really what I do. What you wind up seeing is what I do when you have that stuff crammed down my throat. So how could Larry help me convince a researcher, for instance, that there's a problem with the results due to the observer effect? Well, I talked about data in the sense of looking at things. Because after all, it's a model, so we look at it. But some of the data that you could put together with Larry would be sounds, vocalizations. You could cross-reference, for instance, the sound someone is making with imaging of the internal parts of their vocal tract and put the two together. And when you do that, you can say, okay, we never hear this sound with this shape, so this shape is really closely linked to making that sound, and it's probably because you need this shape to make that sound. And that's very true with everything that's inside. But if you ask me, it's also very true with everything that's outside. And Larry is about more than just the vocal tract itself. It's about the connection of the vocal tract to the rest of the body. So if we were to cross-reference imaging from inside the vocal tract with the sound that people make, and then with imaging from outside their body, so that we can tell Larry not only what shape to make inside his vocal tract, but what posture to use. And we can see if those are actually compatible. And then we can see if we actually do hear those sounds with those postures. And if we actually do see certain configurations with certain postures or not. That kind of cross-referencing could be encouraged if there were a platform that's always looking for new data to update itself so that all of its movements could be more realistic, could be more supported by data. So the idea here is not just crowdsourcing, it's to kind of build a hungry model that is out there looking for data, because you never know what could pop up when you combine different sets of data. You may be asking yourself, can I trust Mr. Opera? Is there any sort of expert, medical expert that's guiding him while he's making this model? And I say to you, sir, I say to you, good madam, that this project is supported by a panel of medical experts, including none other than Dr. Philip Good himself. Hello, my name is Dr. Philip Good. But as I've told your audience before, they can call me Phil. Dr. Phil Good. Thanks for joining us, Dr. Phil Good. So you've seen what I have so far with the Larry project. What do you think about that? Yes, thank you for having me on again, Mr. Opera. May I, for a moment, address the persistent rumors that have been going around? No, that's okay. We don't... Concerning whether or not you and I are, in fact, the same person. Now, it should be very clear, just from my manner of speaking, that I am a completely different person. And we could also point out that you wear glasses all of the time, whereas I wear glasses only for reading. Therefore, it should be obvious that I am in fact a different person. Now, some may point out things like, well, I have similar shirts, but you can see I also have a doctor's coat, and only doctors have access to these kinds of coats. And if you're not sure, you can always look at this. Only a doctor would have access to this. And so, let us continue. I'm sorry for interrupting. Yes. When I say that the thyroarytenoid and the cricothyroid aren't really antagonistic in the way that people are saying, you know, that you don't get more chest voice by tilting the balance towards thyroarytenoid, and you don't get more head voice by tilting the balance towards the cricothyroid. And that basically everything that's going on in there is just more complex than that, and there's no good reason why you would invent this whole CT-TA balance thing. Does that make sense to you when I say that? Well, yes, that's quite true. That's quite true. It's very unfortunate that people are going around saying that the thyroarytenoid and the cricothyroid have a relationship that is somewhat similar to the biceps and the triceps. That's absurd. If we take a look at just any sort of gesture that we'd want to accomplish, we can see all these other muscles would have to be involved. The interarytenoids. We have
everything that's connected to the epiglottis, such as the ariepiglottic folds, and the ariepiglotticus, and the thyroepiglotticus. All of these muscles would be involved. Not to mention, we have the lateral cricoarytenoids that must be engaged if we are to accomplish anything at all with these flimsy little cartilages. Yes, I concur. It would be very, very helpful if people had some way of showing what they are trying to say when they describe these body parts. I think science would agree. And I'm a real doctor, so I would know.
Right, and wouldn't you agree that if it were easy for people to show what they mean when they talk about these things, that maybe they wouldn't come up with such silly things to say?
Yes, I agree. The most helpful thing possible would be for people to start supporting the Laryngocentral Anatomical Research and Reference Interface, LARI. Might I add, I will be joining the project, although you won't see my name. I will be using a pseudonym for privacy.
Joining me, Dr. Feelgood, and thanks so much for coming on the show. And don't worry, your identity is safe with us. We know that you and I are not the same person. That you just have really good taste in shirts. And
thank you for having me, Mr. Opera. And I might remind your audience that they would do well to subscribe to your channel. I know that by subscribing to your channel, I have learned so many things about my voice. Yes, it's also possible to directly support the LARI project in a financial way. I think you have someone to thank in that regard, don't you?
That's right. The LARI project has its first major donor, and that is Egon Elbry. Egon, your donation has already been invested in a new graphics card and CPU. Now I can make these animations much more easily, and I don't have to wait around for so long while my computer tries to digest what I want it to do. But that's not the end. I still need to keep making upgrades, and more importantly, I need to upgrade from a single person working on this project to multiple people working on this project. That's where you come in.